Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's lovely to virtually see so many of you here for our first author event of the Richmond Reads season. Whilst we're just waiting for everybody to join, I'll just say a few words about the season that we're running at the moment and a few of the events that are coming up. So this is our first author event for the Richmond Reads season. So this is the season of events that libraries put on in Richmond, and we run it from October to November. And if you Google Richmond Reads, you will see all of the amazing events that we've got coming up over the next couple of months. And there's too many for me to mention here, but the highlights over the next few days are obviously the event tonight. Tomorrow night, we have a interview with theatre producers and directors who have been busy adapting Agatha Christie for the stage. They're going to talk about the challenges that involves, and we have some of the actors from the upcoming performance. They're going to perform some scenes for us. And then on Saturday, we have our first panel event. That's 4 crime writers, 3 of which have real life experience in the judicial system. We have a judge who now writes, we have an ex-detective, and we have a practicing criminal, what's it called? A criminal defense barrister. And they've all turned their hand to writing fiction, and they're going to tell us about their stories. And next Thursday, we have the international best-selling author, Mark Billingham, in conversation with Abir Mukherjee. He's going to talk about his lengthy career and his writing inspiration. So if you head over to our website, you'll see all of those events and more. We've got writing workshops, we've got events for children, we've got teen author events. So do take a look. Now, for tonight's event, in a moment, I'm going to hand over to author Victoria Princewill, and she'll be talking to Frank Thabani Sayi about his memoir, No Safer, Kinder Hatred. If you've got any questions at all, we're going to try and answer as many as we can towards the end of the event. So do use the Q&A function that you'll see on your screen to ask any questions at all. And right at the end, or maybe tomorrow, we will send you out a feedback form, and we would be really, really grateful if you can fill in the feedback form, because it really helps us inform what we do programming wise for next year, what events you want to see more of, what formats, what type of authors, everything. It all helps us. So if you would fill that in, I'd be super grateful. Right, I think just about everybody has joined now, so I'm going to say a big welcome to Frank and Victoria for joining us tonight, and I will hand over to you for the event. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Welcome everyone to this webinar from Richmond Reads. We're celebrating bold and innovative storytelling, both in person around Richmond-on-Thames and interactively, as we are here today. So I am Victoria Princewill, host of this evening's event, and I am joined by the British Zimbabwean author, Dr. Frank Thabani Sayi. Now, Dr. Sayi has a doctorate in English and Humanities from Birkbeck. He has a master's in critical and cultural studies from SOAS. He's an associate editor of an academic journal by SOAS, and he's lived about 1,000 lives, it's safe to say, having worked for 2.5 decades on the police force as a specialist in child sexual exploitation and modern slavery, and having also been a lecturer in law and business at the Open University. Dr. Sayi came to Britain on a scholarship and trained as a cardiothoracic nurse who worked in the ICU and on gender reassignment surgeries. And most notably of all, Dr. Frank Thabani Sayi is a survivor of colonial Rhodesia, growing up as he did in the apartheid era and living through the violence unleashed across Zimbabwe that followed its independence. We're here to talk about his striking and powerful memoir, a devastating and extraordinary story called No Safer, Kinder Hatred, a remarkable testament to the human experience. So, Dr. Sayi, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for taking time to talk to us.
Wonderful. Could I request we open with a reading from you? And could you maybe tell us a little bit about the one that you choose?
Yeah, thank you. The reading here is to do with a soldier and the young boy, the character in the novel, that develops some kind of intimate relationship. So I'll just read that, and then we can elaborate on that once we get the conversation going. Caspar fell asleep with his hand clutching the belt of bullets that fed into his machine gun. I studied all of him, right down to his giant fingers, and I watched him breathe in, out, in, out. His chest rose and fell. Under his spell, I felt very small, irrelevant. I prayed for myself to grow quicker. If every man in our village was a liar and a coward, I dreamed of becoming a remorseless killer because there was so much power invested in the gun. He was amiable and kind. When he played with Chico, when he relaxed, he folded his camouflage trousers just below the knee. Every so often, he removed his bayonet from his cupboard, looked at it, only to replace it without saying a word. But I noticed the pattern. Whenever I disclosed to him, whatever I disclosed to him determined what happened next. So I had to be extremely careful with my words. On the surface of things, he appeared to enjoy my company, but I was 13 years old. I had no idea why. Perhaps I was the only source of intimacy he had. Inside the madness of war, intimacy was the most persistent of longings. It was inside forbidden tenderness that we knew that we hadn't lost everything. What happened between us stayed under the solitude of the tree. Afterwards, it was hard to feel places in my body with raw nerve endings. Everything felt numb like an overused arm that was no longer part of me. Sometimes I tried to figure out who he really was. But of what use would it be to know the full extent of his monstrosity beyond what I already knew? I could also see in small glimpses that he longed for peace, but I didn't ask him to account for the heaviness of his shoulders. When he drifted into deep sleep, he slept like an ordinary man and not a killer. It was as if he walked through an invisible door beyond which no sound could reach him. There was something remarkable about this kind of tiredness. I think I'll stop there.
That is an incredible, incredible piece. And thank you for reading it.
Thank you.
I have so many thoughts, but I first want to just ask, how would you describe the overall story in your own words if you were going to give a brief summary of this book? And what made you decide to write it?
The book really it covers two very important, significant historical periods in Zimbabwe's history. The first 10 years of colonial rule, followed by the next sort of 5 to 7 years of post-independence, internecine and ethnic violence. It really contradicts those things and the stories that have been told about Zimbabwe, primarily by white Zimbabweans that were there, and most of them really did everything in their power. I mean, I don't recall any of them fighting for us to be equal or to share anything. So when I read the stories about, almost like a pre-Lapsarian Rhodesian period where people lived in the Garden of Eden, when Zimbabwe or Rhodesia was the bread basket of Africa, or the jewel of Africa. I don't have a memory of that time because things were different from us. There was no welfare state for us as Black people. So the book really, to me, is an answer, almost like a retort to the myth of Rhodesia and also the myth of Zimbabwean independence and the fracture lines that kind of showed up as soon as we were given power, and also this idea that we were never paid reparations, we never received a penny from 100 years of subjugation from white rule. So really it covers those three elements, if I can summarize like that.
Wonderful. It makes me think a lot about what Chinua Achebe says about history being written by the victors. And I think it becomes quite powerful to see how that shifts. It was initially told by certain people, and now it's being told by people who perhaps were subjugated at the time and have more room to tell their story now. I have a few questions. I want to ask quite specifically about the process of putting this together, because it's a very personal and painful sounding memoir. From the passage that you read, you're 13, and that's towards the end of the book.
Yes.
So did you keep a diary? Did you have certain moments? Had you written? I know you've been a writer for quite a long time. Had you written short stories about this before? Did you pull together existing notes? Did you have to just go into history? And what was that process for you like? How did you bring the story together?
This story really came about, I think, towards the end of my service in policing. It kind of bothered me for nearly 3-4 decades, that I was going to tell what happened then, but I didn't really have a voice to write this story in essence. So I went back to university, and I obviously did my master's, and then went back to do a PhD. It was through the process of writing my PhD, which focused on Yvonne Vera's book, which is called The Stone Virgins, which was really the first attempt to write about the Zimbabwean genocide, from the perspective of two sisters, one of whom is killed and the other survives. And Yvonne's attempt to really kind of dig deep into the moment of trauma and try and make us see what happened then. And my thesis really was on language, violence, and landscape. It was during this process that I wrote a short story called Shadows, as a result of which I discovered this voice of a young boy. And as soon as that short story kind of it's compressed in a way, but I could see the broader outlines of what could be a book. So, and I think the initial discovery of the voice was important to me. But in terms of writing the book itself, I think it was in the form of short stories, if you like, that didn't cohere in the beginning. And then it was in the aftermath, when I have written all this material. I think I had 1,000 pages. When I gave the manuscript to the publisher and say, here we go. And he came back to me and says, I'm sure there's a story in there somewhere. You need to unpack it. But what I wanted to do is to show them that I wasn't bluffing. I really did have a story. So I knew that I had to unpack it. So really, when I wrote this in individual chapters as short stories, and then I had to amalgamate the whole thing. But then you have to kind of I had to find a way of linking the themes throughout the book, and also who were the main voices. And I was quite keen to bring my grandmother's voice and the voice of the women into the book, because most of the stories about war are told by grown men, with the obviously benefit of history and all of these things. But I wanted to go into those very intimate moments. You know, when you're going to school, when you're sat by the fire with your grandmother, and the stories that she told us, and also this idea of how women hold it together really when men are out carrying guns and being, if you like, the defenders of women and children, but at the same time, the perpetrators of the most heinous violence, and how women responded to this. So to me, the issue of the voice of a little boy with his grandmother kind of became the vehicle for kind of expressing this. I guess this perplexing thing that on one hand you had the Rhodesian soldiers that were bent on inflicting so much damage and violence against people to defend white women and children. Really, that's the concept of most wars, that men set out to defend women and children, and then the most victims of this violence, and the violence is directed at women and children. So that's what happened.
Yes.
So really, in essence, that's what I was trying to do, to balance those things, to bring in the voices of people on the margins. I don't like that term, but the voices of the people who are at the center of the narrative, really, if you like, because they're not on the margins, they're right in the middle of it, and trying to unpack
But his stories are forgotten.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the term I'm looking for. Yeah. Yeah.
And
So
actually, I want to bring you onto that specifically, because I have a lot of questions that really tie into this.
yeah, sure.
When you talk about the themes, and I think trauma, extreme violence, intimacy, these are key themes, and I think they interact quite cyclically together. And I want to ask you about the way in which you understood those things, because one of the things you just spoke about that is quite prevalent in the book is the way in which the women protect the men, if you will, but then they also receive they receive almost the brunt of the violence from their so-called protectors. I think we often know in domestic violence is often where violent acts begin. You see this in all kinds of people who go out and kill, whether it's like school shooters, all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Usually extreme violence will have started by being wrought on women and children. And in this, you see these extremely violent characters. But you mentioned your grandma, you read this piece about Casper. I really want to ask you to tell us a bit about the way in which you see the relationship between trauma, intimacy, and violence in the novel. Because your grandma, you have her saying particular things that would seem quite striking today. She defends the violence of her husband. She looks away from the violence of her son to his wife. At the same time, when you, I think, hit your sister back, she flips out and she's like, I told you never to hit women. And there's this real consistent demonstration of her as a protector. She stands up against the soldiers. She really consistently is just the most fierce and inspirational, but also quite brutal, but also quite loving person. And I really want to hear how you experience her as a young person and how you look back on her character now.
Yeah, I mean, for me, really, my grandmother was a very, very unique individual. Like most matriarchs, she lost her husband. I think she must have been in her early 30s. She never remarried, and she raised me and my two sisters. And afterwards, my other younger sisters that came after me over what maybe is a 40-year period. And she died in her late 80s. She fell over and broke her hip, and that was the end of it. But I never heard her complain about life in general. She would just get up and go and do things. And she used to have a phrase, "Umavuka zenzele," which means a person who gets up and does things for themselves, which is like a word for feminism before I even heard that concept. Her notion of how the world worked wasn't gendered. So my grandmother had no limits in terms of a woman is supposed to do this and a man is supposed to do that. So I was raised in that environment. And I remember for me, when I was a kid, the dogs would bark at night. And usually, like in Africa, the man gets up and has a look what's going on outside. And then, but me, it was like, well, no, why should I go outside? And you guys stay inside. So it's almost as if I was already challenging this idea of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And also for me, the central question of the book really is, who raises boys to be what they are? Because the assumption sometimes is, we live in a violent society because men take boys aside and teach them this. But I mean, there were no male figures in my life when I was growing up. Everything that I knew was from my grandmother and her friends. And there's this issue around my grandmother could be really extremely violent. I mean, really extremely violent in defending us, in defending herself. And sometimes when she had this kind of level of rage, I didn't know where it came from. It just came in bursts, where she just lay into you and really totally. I mean, there's getting beaten up and there's being beaten up. And when as a kid, you just think, come on now, like even like now looking back. But there's also these tender moments, where she would tell us stories at night, and we kind of went into this world that was not violent. We didn't think about white people. We didn't think about the soldiers. We didn't think about the guerrillas or anything violent. It's almost like we had this space where we could go and withdraw. And that's where I guess this ability to tell stories for me came from. We'd read books like my sisters, when she was older, she'd read it like a chapter a night, and we would listen to plays on the radio. And grandma would tell us all these stories about, the impossibility of, men and women fighting during a famine and women winning and all of these stories. So she was I wanted to present a very rounded but also complex character, because women are all either portrayed as very nice or as victims of something, as opposed to actually, if you think deep, and even if you look at the most recent, say, genocide in Rwanda, a lot of women actively took part in what happened in Rwanda, in the fact that they knew the stories because women talk, and when women talk, it's called gossip. But in a war context, it's not really gossip, is it? It's really intelligences who's doing what in the community, and they know a great deal about each other. So when these things happened, they were involved, even though they were victims. So, and again, this dichotomy between what a clear victim is and what a perpetrator of violence is, it becomes really kind of complicated in a way. And because I didn't see victims and I didn't see people who were suspect, almost like perpetrators. One minute you can be a victim of something, and if you ever grew up in a very violent environment, even I, as a kid, we didn't have tools to resolve conflicts. It was like, if you hit me, and I think there's a story in there where a friend or like a boy from school it's kind of hit me on the head with the stone. It's not, you know, I mean, here that would be like a parents would be meeting and discussing why this boy is violent and the rest of it. For us, it was just standard. You know, you got a rock on your head. So what standard? You go back to school and you fight some more. And so I grew up with this impression that to resolve conflict is what you did. But then again, I had a shift, I guess, I think around by the age of 13, 14, after that war. And I just thought the violence that I saw was just people, men particularly, were very impotent in the truest sense of the word. Because if you ever see how people become violent, if they want something, they can't get it. And there's something intrinsically human they can't get to. And all they can do is try and destroy you. But really, all it is self-hatred and for things they can't control. And it's just an act of projection, in the same way that white supremacy is projection about the things that whites hated about themselves, about the things that were evil about themselves. So they turn Black people into these monsters that absorb all these kind of horrendous things they think about us, so they can destroy us. But really, in essence, that hatred is almost like the weaponization of hatred. Let's just call this thing the N-word. And then once we call this person the N-word, we can then use all these ideas that comes, you know, that kind of class around you, and then we can do what we like to you, in a
I'm
way.
glad that
Yeah.
I'm glad that you sort of said that you brought together the
Mm.
the violence of the apartheid, the violence of the Gukurahundi, the sort of post-apartheid
Mm.
uh, Mugabe, you know, the sort
Mm.
of terror under Mugabe, the violence in intimate places, because I think I noted that they all that a lot of this projection, because I think it's an idea I come to the same conclusion about, but you can see it very clearly in the book, where you just see people are, to your point about how there's an inability to resolve trauma, and it just is almost projected. The frustrations a person has, their impotence is projected onto those around them who seem, you know, who are vulnerable, which in a
Yeah.
way brings me to two things I want to ask you about. A little more about Casper, because obviously he's a member of the Gukurahundi.
Mm.
By the time we get to the scene, we've seen him do all manner of just
Yeah.
terrifying things.
Mm.
And then there's even the way in which he treats you. And I want to first note, you know, you talk about how there's not a way to resolve trauma, and you talk about the boy hitting you with the stone. I thought it was
Yeah.
really interesting. You have a friend who seems to be actually trying to counsel you away from continuing violence, right? Like what you, and I
Yes.
thought this is,
Yeah.
and in a way, I thought that was a beautiful portrayal of the multiplicity of perspectives, right? People respond to things in different ways, even in that
Yeah.
community. But I'm curious, I guess, how you make sense of the dynamic with Casper and what he did to you, which, you know, would be considered sexual abuse in everywhere, I think.
Yes.
And I don't think you pretend it's not, but I think also the way you respond to it ties into this sense of the tender and the terrifying existing in the same space. And uh, I want to hear more from you of how you
It's I think in war, and I really brought that particular story into focus, because um when soldiers spend time with young girls or young women, everyone kind of predicts what happens there, even though the community is really powerless to do anything. You know, I saw, like, when I obviously during that war, when grown men, they had their daughters taken in front of them, 13, 14-year-old, 15-year-old girls, and even sometimes their wives taken away from them, and they knew what would happen afterwards. Because, I mean, men of war can only take women and girls into the bush to do one thing. But if you're a little boy and you spend time with soldiers, nobody ever predicts or ever thinks, and I guess maybe even if it did cross their mind, nobody had the language to kind of express what was happening, let alone to you as a child. So if you are a little boy and you have a person that's showing you a level of tenderness, and, you know, we can unpack the whole idea of consent. Let's just suspend for a moment the idea that you got a 13-year-old or 12-year-old boys hanging out with a soldier in what appears to be really, or is really, kind of very intimate circumstances. And we can discuss consent, as in people think, oh, you know, did you agree to this or did you not? And this idea of consent, for me, that I kind of thought about, that it really is a complex thing. I mean, how do you consent to act like that if you're a boy in a war context? Or even if girls sometimes did date soldiers, but were they really dating those soldiers? In that kind of an imbalance of power and the kind of skewed power dynamic in an environment that's very brutal to them. So it's a mix like the economics of war, how people survive wars. You really, even like as a little boy, that character has learned pretty quickly that to survive, this is what you do. And you have to read people's language, the spoken language that people speak every day, and the other forms of language that are unspoken, other things that are unspoken about. Because if you want to understand people and environments, you don't pay attention to the things that are said. You pay attention to things that's not being said. And I learned this when I first came to this country, where there's apart from obviously the difficulty of speaking in the English that people spoke here and listening to different accents and trying to figure out, but it's also this idea of people here wouldn't say to you things directly if they don't, like what you're doing. They might just kind of react in a particular way. And so you and this new territory now where you have to kind of figure out, am I saying the right thing the right way here? Am I behaving the way that I should? And the same thing applies to spaces where you are outnumbered or you are very vulnerable. And also I wanted to unpack this idea of violence, intimacy, and war, and the idea of trauma in those spaces. And the things that people are willing to do, not willing to do, really things that you're compelled to do to survive as a survival mechanism. Because, and also in particular for me, for boys and the things that I saw and witnessed, that adults wouldn't say anything. So it's as if like the whole structure around this sense of community completely collapsed. And in this kind of space, you had these people that would just take what they wanted in a way. However, whichever way you want to put this, they just took what they wanted, whether it was sleeping with girls, whether it was sleeping with boys, or it was just like just being violent. So I was kind of trying to personalize the narrative and also to kind of bring attention to this whole idea of the vulnerability of the boy child during the war. And I think you very rarely see that kind of narrative. And I think the only place I've ever kind of come across it is in a film. I think it's called Beasts of No Nation with Idris Elba, where one of the rebels is giving the boys, making them inhale black powder mixed with something, and then he rapes them. But it's something that's not spoken about much. So I wanted really to kind of to bring all of that, and also, and I touch on what happened to men when they're in detention, that the older boys that were taken in detention, and one of them was talking about how just men came and went, but he didn't kind of describe it as in a way that I was sexually assaulted. But when I heard the story when it was being told, I didn't know then, but now as a grown up, I was thinking, so this is what was going on, But men would not come back and say, this is what happened to me. So they'll be stunned. They wouldn't say anything to anyone. Life goes on, and then they'll erupt in a different way. So and when you are a man and that's been done to you by other men, it's almost like this kind of prestige that you have as a male, nothing can happen to me type thing, is gone. And also for men who were beaten in front of their wives and their kids, and I mean like really, really thoroughly humiliated. They had to reassert their manhood somehow, and the only way they could do it was to beat up their wives. So I'm not condoning this, but don't get me wrong. I'm just saying,
you're describing the process of how they saw
exactly. Yeah. So it's a bit like this analogy that I normally use, that a man beats up his wife, the wife beats up the kids, and the kids, the oldest sibling beats up the youngest sibling, and the youngest child kicks the dog bites the cat, and then the cat just going to do something else. But it's almost like this cascade of events that almost like evolve around. You have an intimate relationship with someone that can explain to you why they feel the rage they have in them. And if you ask the wrong question, if you say the wrong thing, that triggers something in them, and they unleash these violence.
Even if you're just there at the right time, and they
and also this Yeah. And also for me, this link between, I mean, I think violence in Rhodesia, particularly in the white community itself, was a thing, even though they didn't want to kind of paint that picture that their men drank a lot, they fought a lot, and they were violent at the weekends. Because you can't do what those men did and come home and be normal. I don't care what you say. If you read Frantz Fanon, I think it's The Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about this white soldiers who go to the villages in Algeria and do these horrible, horrible things. And they come home, they're completely violent, unhinged. And everyone is trying to understand why they're doing these things. So to me, I guess this book really is attempting to explain that link between state structural violence to communal violence to individual violence, that there's always a trajectory. And also this idea of impunity in the white Rhodesian machine that kind of follows through in the post-independence period. But now when you listen to the narrative, it's as if like Robert Mugabe invented impunity. He didn't. It was always part of the structure, because the colonial encounter in Africa and the colonial enterprise on the African continent was always based on white men being violent, and this kind of limitless violence, and that wasn't kind of checked by anyone. You could go over there and do what you liked as long as you got money, made money out of it. So we can never talk about the story of the farm in Zimbabwe without elaborating on the heavy toll that it's had on the lives of ordinary Black people, still has, so.
There's almost a through line, it sounds like. And I want to actually ask you a couple of questions about the politics specifically and sort of post-independence betrayal, because that is the way it's sort of characterized in the book as well, that people who were formerly dissidents have now come back and basically terrorized the people who protected them whilst they were fighting ostensibly for independence prior to that. And so the way I saw it, to me, it seemed like the post-apartheid era under Mugabe was no less partisan or sadistic than the apartheid itself. It was, racism replaced by another form of sectarianism. And I think you touched upon that, the way in which it's almost like violence begets violence and impunity begets impunity, and the culture continues. And I wonder how you saw that as a child. I mean, a lot of my thinking and curiosity is just about the difference between what you saw then and how you see it now. But I'm curious about how did it, because to me as a reader, I see almost that the apartheid, the racism, the rationale, it's just the frame that one set of people have chosen to justify them doing this, and then another. It seems like the violence is more a reflection of human nature pretty consistently under a deeply broken system that has afforded people impunity in particular places. Do you see what I mean? And I wonder whether that is a fair characterization, or whether it seemed distinctly racial and then what followed was a unique betrayal, or whether it seemed, because like, how did you see the post-independence violence versus the colonial violence, versus you talk about the extreme things that the guerrillas were doing, even to their own side, in the name of independence. And I wonder how these almost seemingly contradictory things that had consistently bring out the worst in people and fracture communities. What do you take away from that as a child observing?
When I was a kid, it's like this was spoken about at home. This low-level hatred stuff. I don't like to use the word tribes, but when you live in a country that has different ethnic groups, there is a tendency for people to say, the Shono like this and Ndebele like this. So if you mention like in your head the map of Zimbabwe, and you draw a line from the tip just above the Victoria Falls all the way down to where the Limpopo River is at the bottom, the southwest of the country is where mostly Ndebele people live. Ndebele people are descendants of Zulu people in South Africa in terms of language, in terms of cultural outlook. So I could go and live in South Africa now. In terms of language, they wouldn't even know that I'm not from there. Right. So whereas the people from Mashonaland, they speak a different language altogether, and it was a different culture. But the history that was passed on from generation was the Ndebele people were invaders that came from South Africa, took over the land in Zimbabwe and raped women and children, Mashonaland, and took, cattle from. So, and then when the whites came, and again, it was that divide and rule sort of thing that whites used. So they were defending people in Mashonaland against the wrath of the Ndebele, who were just marauding kind of thugs with spears and whatnot. So, and even after independence, there was like a guy, a soldier, I think his name was Lieutenant Lano Richie, I could be wrong, Dyke, sorry. He made a comment, because he was the head of the paratroop regiment, and he was tasked with funding his dissidents. So this so-called dissidents, like 140 men, that were just going around the country. That's what in the beginning they're just called thugs. They were thieves, and they're just robbing buses and getting money and the rest of it. And then all of a sudden there's a shift, because Robert Mugabe wanted to make an example of the people of Matebele, who didn't vote for him, by the way, during the first election. So for him, in his head, it was almost like an incomplete victory. And he just wanted to make sure that people that didn't vote for him and rejected him were going to pay for it. And he just used, again, the divide and rule sort of thing that the colonists had used. And the ex-Rhodesian soldiers just say to him, the Ndebele people respond better to violence, best to violence. So that's what he did. And the infrastructure that was used in terms of the CIO's offices, the so-called CID offices, and the prisons, the underground torture centers, and even the legislation that he used was all part of what he inherited from the colonial system, right? So, and yeah, and Ian Smith had a group of soldiers they called Sailor Scouts, named after the guy who first arrived in Zimbabwe, and he went north hunting and shooting everything wherever he was going. There were a select group of soldiers that were trained, especially they're just trained in guerrilla warfare, and they would just go out on their own for months on end without anyone knowing what they were doing. So that sometimes they would go into a community and identify, say, members of the police force who were on leave, and they'll kill them, pretending that they were guerrillas. And then the military would then come back. The military would then come back and say, this is what happened. So asking local people to tell them what happened. Local people knew. If you see a white person who's got like a paint on their face, you know it's a white person. They're not guerrillas. But that's the method they use. So they kind of pretend they were guerrillas and pretend, and then they do really, really, really horrible things. It's the same thing that Robert Mugabe's troops did. So he had a select group of soldiers who were trained by North Koreans. They only answered to him. Nobody could intervene. The police couldn't intervene in what they were doing. The ordinary military couldn't intervene in what they were doing. So these were specially selected young men who came straight from camps in Mozambique after the war. And their task was to do this one thing that he called to plant and renew. I mean, that's like a genocide language, really, right there. So they were trained for that one thing alone. They were not interested in trying to find dissidents. They're not interested in finding anything else. They were just there to brutalize people as a political force. So, just you are aligned with the system. So it's a bit like an incomplete revolution that was designed to finish what Mugabe started, and they couldn't really, I mean, the frustration as well was he couldn't really get rid of whites the way he wanted. Because I think the Western world just told him that, you stop the war, or, we won't support this, not any other. And he was really frustrated in that, because I think history books show that he wanted an all-out war, like Samora Machel had done in Mozambique, where he didn't have to negotiate with the Portuguese, he just completely overran them and kicked them out of the country. That's what he wanted. But the Zimbabwean situation, obviously, because of the British and the Americans, and the fact that there were white Anglo-Saxon people there, they couldn't allow for that kind of thing. But for the Ndebele people, unfortunately, that wasn't the case, because nobody cared for 7 years when this was going on. I think nobody really cared. Yeah, go on.
I want to know that is incredibly powerful. I'm aware we have some questions, so I want to bring up my last few questions on this and just pivot straight to their questions. And these are a little more about, you in particular. So I remain, I think, humbled and a little inspired because reading your memoir and discovering that most of what you'd seen came before you were 13 was quite intense for me and
Wow.
quite striking. And so
Yeah.
I was moved by how, with all the violence that you saw when you were so young, this relentless brutality, that when you got a scholarship and moved to the UK, your first move was to make caring your profession. You became you trained as a cardiothoracic nurse, and I think that matters because we have just talked about how people responded to violence and trauma with more violence and trauma, and they brought it on their loved ones. And so,
Mm.
for your response to be from the outside, that you will, instead of going to enact violence, instead of going to, I don't know, pursue medicine, which involves a lot of cutting up people, you were going to care for people, is, I really believe, like a testament to just your incredible courage. And I want to know if that was intentional, especially because then afterwards you went into policing. I wonder whether you might actually, be better if police officers had done training in nursing. But I want to hear a bit about that before I get to everyone's questions. Could you talk to me a bit
Okay.
about your life post?
Yeah,
But
yeah. I mean, I think for me, really, I was one of the lucky few because um, I was clever at school. Really clever anyway. I'm not patting my own back here. I probably came top of my class with one or two guys who's now one of my classmates is now got an international IT company. That's how I was. I was driven. But the thing that drove me into nesting was I had a girlfriend when I was about 15 or 16 or something. Like not like a real girlfriend. But her brother-in-law was a nurse. So I was visiting there one day and he had this white tunic on. And I was saying, well, what's that? He goes, he's a nurse. Like you're in Africa, you're like a male nurse. I was like, what? So I never heard about this before. So as fate would have it, I ended up here, went to uni first, and then I was just deciding what would I want to do. I didn't want to go down and do medicine. I just thought it was protracted and I didn't like this the stiffness around it. So, and then I ended up becoming a nurse. We were the first kind of cohort of students called Project 2000, who was designed to kind of reshape nursing into this really kind of focused. We spent 2 years at uni and then 1 year doing a practical kind of nursing care. But for me, caring for people, and I think this is one thing that trauma does. You think you are in charge of the decisions that you're making, but half the time I didn't feel that was. It's almost like subconsciously I've always drifted towards these things. I didn't know that that's where I was going to end up, but for some reason, I just end up having conversation with different people and I've drifted in these areas. So even like in the areas of nursing that I chose, before when I was in ITU, intensive care unit, I used to also work in a dialysis ward. And there's a man there, I'm just because to respect his family, just in case somebody recognized, I won't name his name, but he was from Uganda and he came in there with swollen feet and end stage kidney failure. So I was connecting him to the machines on the ward for dialysis. And then obviously when every African came on the ward got tested for HIV and he was HIV positive. So because back then in 1989, 1990, we didn't know understand HIV and AIDS as well as we do now. So we had to put like a double gloves and aprons and masks and all these things. So it's almost like he was completely, and I remember him just sitting there crying. But when a human being is crying like that in front of you, this very kind of fragile masculinity that kind of breaking down in front of you. And me as a nurse, that's when I kind of thought, okay, there's just more to this. But I didn't understand it, and I didn't understand how HIV and AIDS would come back to haunt me the rest of my life because most of the people that I knew that I grew up with in Zimbabwe that never left, the young people, my sisters in that fold, all died from it. But I cared for somebody for 4, 5, 6 months. Um,
wow.
and it just struck me as, and so when I went back uh, to Africa to bury my mom in the first instance, I'd already kind of gone through all of it. I didn't care for people in my family, but I'd all understood and been through this kind of roller coaster of at the age of 22, you know, I'd already kind of bathed dead bodies, prepared them for families, like really
No,
kind
of
of,
course.
yeah. But so all of those things. So to me, it's as if like a trauma chooses you in a particular way, and it drives you towards certain things subconsciously, of course.
No, of course.
Yeah, it's almost like there's something in the unconscious that just drives you to make certain decisions, and you think that's you making those decisions, those choices. And then
And I suppose you also be prepared to handle these for better or for worse. For one moment, because we are running incredibly
yeah,
close to the end, and I can see we've got actually quite a few really good questions. I
okay,
do want to get to them, and I don't want to monopolize your
No, that's
time.
fine.
So quickly, I just want to say to everyone, there is a Q&A function, and it should be at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, please click on the option button that says more, and send in any question that you have. I just want to get through, sorry for that background there. I just want to get through some of these questions. People are asking, first of all, what was the hardest part of this book for you to write?
Oof. I think the beginning of the book where I go back to Zimbabwe after my mum had passed away. There's a section in there that the publishers thought was triggering, that I couldn't, it had been removed, but I still believe that it was the best part of the book. So you hear there's reference in there me saying what happened in that room frightened me. So at that time I was a young.
When you were with the man and you saw the man and the little boy, that part
No.
at the beginning.
Yeah. When I go to see my grandmother and everything fell in place, I make a comment that say what happened in that room frightened me, meaning when I was in London, but nobody knows what happened in that room because the section that was removed. So basically, I woke up one day. I used to live at Paddington Green Police Station above. It's Naya Hotel, but I used to have police accommodation in there. And I woke up one day, and I thought my room needs painting for whatever reason. So I ran down the stairs across the Edgware Road into this DIY shop, and I bought like a pen of paint, a can of paint, purple, for whatever reason. And I came back to my room, and I painted my room in the color purple. And I sat there and I thought, it's missing something. So I then ran back and I bought white paint, and I painted like a big giant cross the opposite end of my bed. And then something happened, and I thought, I haven't spoken to my mother in a while. In that moment, I left the room, turned left on the corridor. Back then, you used to use international dialing code cards, and there's like a phone on the wall. And I obviously dialed the number, and the man the other end picks up the phone in my mother's last working place. At which point he just says to me, she's dead. It didn't even ask me, who are you? And give me any context, or are you sitting down, or anything like that. So it was like reliving that moment. And I don't remember really precisely how I booked the ticket to go to Africa. And it was just all in a haze. But it was almost like for me, just going step by step, rewriting that moment, trying to make sense of it. But looking back now, obviously, I was having a mental breakdown, but I didn't know what it was. You know,
of course.
Because
I'll take the next few questions all at once,
Yeah.
but I'm just aware that I've monopolized this a little.
Yeah,
okay,
fine.
so people have asked, okay, interesting questions. Where did the title come from? Are you working on something new now? And you say you wrote this as a short story. Do you still write short stories? And if so, what are they about?
Okay, a long question. So the title of the book really came towards the end when I finished writing the book. I didn't have that in my mind when I started it. So it was when I finished the book and I was just thinking, what am I going to call this? And really it came from this idea that people can do horrible things to people, all in the, this thing where people say, oh, it's all in your interest. You ever worked in a place as a police officer? I used to get told, back in the day, you wouldn't be allowed to be sitting in the car with me. Things are better now because we're no longer calling you the N-word. Or my grandmother used to say, if a man doesn't, in relation to women, if a man doesn't beat you up, it means they don't love you, right? And I found that was an oxymoron. So really, I was, and also this idea that, you know, racism in Africa was because of white people so wanted to they were so desperate to save us from our own barbarism, that they just inflicted so much violence and hurt and everything as they did, all to try and save Black Africans, or, you know, that our land was in their safer hands because. So they're not kind of kind in thinking, really, there is no safer kind of hatred. Whatever it is you do to
Exciting.
people, yeah. So that's where that came from.
Look, powerful, really very
Mm.
powerful. Okay, and so I'll just restate the other two
Oh yeah,
questions. Are you working on something now? And then the one about the short stories.
okay. What I'm working, without going into too much detail. So obviously there's a continuation of where I left off at the 13-year-old. So that would cover my early years in the United Kingdom, my years in policing, and things that have happened in between. But really, it all has to do with trauma and the things that I went through. And the areas that I've worked in policing, child sexual exploitation, counterterrorism, so-called black on black violence. And my last posting, my last 5 years in policing, which is like a child criminal exploitation and modern slavery. So all of those things that I came across, and again, the focus for me really is this idea of structural violence and trauma, and this idea of, I think, if you're a traumatized individual, you can go either way. You become violent yourself, or you try and save everybody else, and how vulnerable that makes you as well as a human being, because I've kind of made the wrong choice in terms of friendships or people that you don't see them coming, because and also in way that I dealt with people when I was in the police, when I was trying to kind of understand what their history is, and having an intrinsic understanding. They didn't care. Half of them didn't care. And then you're in this environment where everyone has empathy fatigue, and you're not, because you know, when you grew up in an environment where people are brutalized, or where there's a story of violence, and you go to a woman that's saying, no, he hasn't done anything to me, but you look and you think, I know he's done something.
Yeah.
But the person you're with is saying to you, no, let's move on. You know, so yeah, so that's my next project, in a nutshell.
I relate to that a lot.
Mhm.
Okay, and so, but that sounds exciting. I'm very excited to read that when that comes out. So, okay, second to last is, you say you wrote this first as a short story. Do you still write short stories? And if so, what are they about? And the last question that we've just seen so far is about the number of books you have behind you, and what books do you enjoy reading? Or what do you enjoy reading? Books, novels, plays, whatever.
Okay, yeah, I still write short stories, and I think short stories, as a way of writing, literary form, they capture so many things, and they're compressed, and cover so much ground. So if you really are interested in short stories, if you read Jorge Borges, the Argentinian writer, I think
Yes,
yeah,
phenomenal.
exactly, Labyrinth.
So
Yeah. So it's like this story that just takes you in a spiral, and when you finish it, you think, what's happened here? And then you go back to the beginning. So I think short stories really kind of interrogate you, and they ask of you a tremendous amount of investment. So you actually try and understand what is going on, and then you go back and read some more. So yeah, so I tend to read. I like I've read, obviously, most of kind of prominent African writers: Wole Soyinka, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Chinua Achebe, the people that I grew up reading, and because I didn't understand that, I didn't know up until I read African writers that African people can write books in English. It's like, okay, so that's great. But what I have behind me really just covers a lot, because of my teaching career at university. I got novels, I got critical theory, but I also have black books, um, that cover just a wide range of authors, from particularly women authors on the African continent and what their preoccupations are. Books on Black feminism. I'm going through that in a minute, and the differences, and I'm trying to learn. And obviously, as an older man, I'm trying to keep up with young people are doing, and the evolution of language per se. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Oh, I love that. Okay, I have a final question for you. Yeah, we've just got about 4 minutes left, and I want to know um, what your hopes for the book are, for its readers and for Zimbabwe.
When I set out to write this book, really, for me, it was almost like not almost. It was this compulsion to intervene and to tell the story of Rhodesia and Zimbabwe from a different perspective, from the one that was kind of being dished out there. And also, white Zimbabweans are now going back to Africa after nearly 30, 40 years absence because things have changed. But they're not coming because they care about the continent, not because they care about the people. They're going to do exactly the same thing and be dominant in those areas that they have always been dominant in. And this idea of white on land, which kind of alarmed me, thinking, what does that mean? And why that misnomer on the African continent? I think this book, if it does anything, it is a historical record. And I think young people 20, 30 years from now should read it and think, so this is how things were then. Because things will happen, people who left the country when they were young, born in foreign countries. And trauma has a very, very strange way on affecting people psychologically, particularly, and in terms of how they relate to other people. The things you never actually understood up until you read something, you think, oh, okay, now I understand that. So for me, like, particularly that moment when I'm painting the room purple, I didn't understand what was going on to me. I was only about 27, 28 then. I didn't understand then what was going on. But looking back now, when you have no recourse to psychological help, you have no recourse to people that can say, mate, are you think? And I remember my then girlfriend, she's now my wife, coming in to visit me, looking at the wall, thinking, are you okay? Because she could read and see that something was wrong. But to me, it was just like, just expressing up things and thinking the wall's purple and, But I mean, to me, I also want to leave people this idea of hope, which is where the book ends with me.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, this idea of hope that as long as we have hope, then we have so much to live for. Because if people lose hope, then we are all done for. I think
we're doomed, and we don't need to lose hope. Precisely.
Yeah.
Where can people find you? Where on social media? Do you have an Instagram?
I have
where can people follow?
I have an Instagram page with my full name on it, and I'm trying to update things as I'm going along in terms of events and other things that I'm interested in and what people follow me. So it's a new experience for me. I think what working as a police officer did to me was always cautious to have my details out there and doing things. And again, policing is such a traumatic environment to work in, and you have to figure out when you leave, decompress, reconfigure your place in the world as a free person, because you've been institutionalized for nearly 2 centuries and a half. Sorry, a quarter of a century in there. So for me, it's like trying to find a way in the world and a level of peace, if you like, and learning to live with myself as me. And so I would have things out there, as time allows and when I get confident with the technology and the rest of it. So, but look out for this space. I'm sure there's more events to follow, and also some of my work. I'll be posting some of my short stories on social media so people can get a flavor of what I write about.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Sayi. Thank you for this talk. Thank you for your book. No Safer, Kinder Hatred. It is a powerhouse of a memoir to read. I cannot imagine what it was to write, and I encourage and urge everyone to get a copy if they don't already. I genuinely think it will change your life and change how you think about humanity. Thank you for taking the time today, and thank you to Richmond Reads for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you so much to Victoria for curating such a thoughtful questions for us tonight, and for Frank talking so eloquently and openly about his book, which of course is available from Richmond Libraries, along with lots of the other authors that Frank mentioned as inspirational or people that he enjoyed reading. Thank you so much for attending tonight as well. We will send out the feedback forms to you over the next couple of days. And once again, we'd really appreciate you filling them in, and do head over to the website to see what other events we have going on. Thank you very much. Good night.